Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Aiken, and welcome to everyone to today's RAPS webcast, The Shifting Global Regulatory Landscape, Dealing with Regulatory Affairs in an Uncertain Environment. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items I just want to go over. First is to remind everyone that you will have a copy of the recording for on-demand access for 1 year after the program today. So please remember to return to the RAPS Learning Portal to access that on-demand recording, and we'll make that available there within 48 hours after the program today. So we've taken a screenshot of the attendee interface. So if you have not run a webcast with us before, we'll just go over the basics real quick on how to participate for today's program. And the phone dial-in information will be displayed there. And lastly, if you would like to ask questions to our presenters today, please submit your questions in the questions box there at the bottom, and we'll read your questions aloud for the audience and the presenters at the end of the program today. So with that basic housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to welcome everyone and introduce our presenters for today, Joseph Lamendola, Graham Higson, and Steve Pondell from Your Encore. Joe has over a 30-year regulatory career, and Joe has been responsible for 30+ approvals across 10+ therapeutic areas. With hundreds, if not thousands, of agency interactions under his belt, Joe provides clients with the insights, relationships, and credibility needed to bring drugs to patients quicker. Beyond drug development, Joe is an expert in strategic alliance governance and organization design, having developed the first BMS U.S. regulatory organization. Prior to joining Your Encore, Joe served as the U.S. VP of Regulatory Science for Bristol Myers Squibb and VP of Regulatory Affairs with U.S. and Global Experience for Schering-Plough. In this role, Joe was responsible for leading this regulatory strategy for all global programs across this preclinical, clinical, and approval stages. Joe believes his ability to collaborate among matrixed organizations and maintain a sense of humor throughout the thrills and challenges of drug development have largely contributed to his success. Graham Higson has over 35 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry. Since 2014, he has worked as a regulatory consultant specializing in the provision of strategic regulatory advice, drug development, regulatory outsourcing, and organizational development. Prior to his shift to consulting, he was managing director of NDA Advisory Services, where he was accountable for the organization's regulatory and HTA advisory boards. Early in his career, Graham was the global head of regulatory affairs for the medical diagnostics division of GE Healthcare and has spent 5 years at AstraZeneca as vice president and global head of regulatory affairs, where he led the regulatory organizations across 6 R&D sites in the UK, Sweden, US, and Japan. He held a number of senior regulatory positions in the UK and USA during his 11-year tenure at Pfizer, and has also worked at Genesa, Sandoz, excuse my pronunciation, Ciba Geigy, and Synthlabo, and Baxter Healthcare, Graham has served on the EFPIA and PHRMA Regulatory Affairs Committees and the CMR Regulations Advisory Board and the TOPRA Regulatory Advisory Council. He's also a member of the NDA Regulatory Advisory Board, comprised of former senior European regulators and industry experts. Steve Pondell is a CMC expert in the manufacturing compliance and regulatory aspects of product development, from clinical manufacturing through global regulatory approvals into commercial production. He has experience working with small biotech companies as well as multinational pharmaceutical companies, and has served as a contract manufacturer and as a virtual manufacturing outsourced manager. His specialty is assisting companies work across the sponsor contract manufacturing relationship, creating high performance partnerships on a global basis. Steve presently serves as a managing expert of the Regulatory Center of Excellence at Your Encore. As an expert consultant, Steve has helped a variety of small to medium-sized pharma and biotech companies with projects that include GMP gap analyses, product development programs, and CMC regulatory dossiers, CGMP compliance and supplier audits, and business development activities for a global logistics provider. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to our presenters to get the program started.
Alex, thank you very much. Hi, all. This is Joe Lamendola speaking. And before we jump into our presenters today, both Graham and Steve, I just wanted to give you a quick background on Your Encore and the Regulatory Center of Excellence. For those of you that don't know, Euroncore is a specialized consultancy offering strategic and technical advisory services to clients in the life sciences and consumer goods industries. Our team consists of accomplished industry veterans who provide outcomes-oriented solutions across the product development lifecycle with various centers of excellence where we specialize in quality, regulatory, and clinical. Through our regulatory center of excellence, we are able to provide our clients with both strategic advisory and operational support as they navigate compliance with global regulatory agencies. Our diverse team includes former industry executives, practitioners, and FDA professionals who are well positioned to help our clients anticipate and mitigate risk. We provide effective strategic guidance for every regulatory milestone along the drug development continuum, experienced counsel on emerging regulatory intelligence and policy, and tactical hands-on support for day-to-day operations and regulatory submissions. Our intent today, although it has changed dramatically since we first started to discuss the evolving regulatory landscape and the uncertainty of the landscape, but our intent today is to discuss the shifting landscape within regulatory and clinical research, the implications that it has on CMC, as well as our long-term outlook. And we look forward to your questions as well to stimulate additional discussion. So with that, I would like to hand it off to our first presenter, Graham Hickson. Graham will deal with the clinical regulatory aspects of the uncertainty. And Graham, if you would.
Okay, thanks a lot, Joe. So first of all, we thought we'd do a little bit of background in the context and thinking about the milestones in drug regulation over the years. We can think back to the early 1960s when there was the thalidomide disaster and essentially the birth of many of the current regulations that we have today. Also then, the next major one I've noted down here was the COX-2 inhibitors and the Vioxx withdrawal at the end of September 2004. And that created really what I feel was a change from focusing on benefits of drugs to thinking about risks. And that's when we saw that bit of a shift in the pendulum. And potentially COVID-19 could be another. So we all know that there are various, what I would call salvage conversations that are taking place with regulators about the ongoing trials. And maybe the companies are starting to think about what I've described here as outside the envelope options that maybe just 3 months ago were unimaginable to what we'd be thinking about. We're already hearing about virtual advisory committee meetings. And therefore, I just wonder whether the creative solutions that are being accepted today may well become the norm of tomorrow. So perhaps we'll get a little bit into that a little bit later in the slides. But certainly we think about what's happening with COVID-19 and you think about the headlines we've all seen in the press regarding hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir. And you need to think about what the expectations of hope are, but also we might need to think about the management of the hype around those things. So perhaps if we move on to the next slide. So we think about the development programs that we have going on. So think about the ongoing clinical studies today. We're all planning to do our NDAs in the coming months or a couple of years. So every NDA that contains clinical data from studies that are ongoing during this pandemic is going to have unique considerations. There's going to be protocol amendments and implications on each study, and we've got to think about what the extent of the data scrutiny is going to be on those studies. Now we think about site inspections and what is and is not possible going forward and how comfortable agencies can get in the future compared with how they've been in the past. So let's just think about the NDA content versus what we might have all agreed with the agency during end of phase 2 meetings. So we go to FDA for the end of phase 2 meeting, and we come away with an understanding, if not necessarily a total agreement, on what is going to go into the NDA and what would form the basis of the review by the agency. So COVID-19 could create a situation where we can no longer deliver on the agreements that we made with the agency. So are we going back to the agency to negotiate a new agreement, or are we going to rely on the strength of data that we will put together and present to the agency in the NDA? And I think different companies will have different views on that. If we do decide to go to the agency, and clearly there's the guidance that they have issued, and with the Q&As, the most recent update to which was just yesterday, how long can we wait to get a response from the agency? I know there's an opportunity to have very rapid engagement, but I heard recently that there's about a 30% increase in workload at the agency as a result of COVID-19. Now, what do we do in the meantime with the clinical studies that we have ongoing? I think in many cases, we as experienced regulatory professionals or experienced clinical professionals in the industry, we'll do what we think is right for the trial and for the patients. But I'm sure there's many situations when we think, you know, there's all this guidance that's out there, we see what's going on, but we have a unique situation with our ongoing trial that we feel we want to have some engagement with the agency on. And then what happens if FDA doesn't agree with what the company is trying to do? What do we do there? So perhaps we can get into some of this in Q&A a bit later. So let's think about the advisory committees. Over the recent past, we've seen a bit of a reduction in the number of advisory committees that are being held. Will the agency ask for more advisory committees in the future? And also think about how the advisory committees take place and what are the practicalities in holding more advisory committees. Therefore, what will happen going forward? Will we see an increase in the number of complete response letters versus first-time approvals as a result of this? And then what's going to happen about PDUFA dates? Will FDA decide they're going to miss more PDUFA dates, or will they meet the PDUFA dates and issue the complete response letters if they haven't been able to complete the review? And then we are also about to enter a new PDUFA cycle and a renewal. So what kind of conversations will we be having between the industry and the agency about PDUFA going forward, and what might that mean? So lots of things to think about. So maybe if we can go on to the next slide and then just talk a little bit more about advisory committees. And I think every company that's had an advisory committee that's scheduled since mid-April is going to have a story here. I work with a couple of companies that I know that some of the conversations that are going on, and I'm sure we're going to see the start of virtual advisory committees in the coming weeks. So let's see what that's going to entail. Will we try and do them partially face-to-face and then have others dialing in? Will it be totally remote, or what's going to happen? And what are the practicalities and the logistics of how that's going to work? I'm sure there's going to be legal implications, and whether everybody gets the opportunity to ask the questions that they want to ask, and then making sure that the voting takes place in an appropriate manner, and that every panelist has the opportunity to vote, and they don't get held up by technology. But I'm sure there's ways to make these work. We've seen so many ways of working differently over these past few months. So may virtual advisory committees become the reality and become the norm going forward? And what does industry want from this? Is that how industry wants to work? or do they want to go back to how it was up till 3 months ago? So just a few questions we can ponder on a little bit later, and say we welcome your conversations, discussions on that. So I think moving to the next slide, we want to move now to think about some implications for CMC. At this point, I'll hand over to my colleague, Steve Pondell.
Thank you, Graham. Let's talk a little bit about regulatory challenges. And as Joe mentioned at the beginning here, I think we've been talking about this webinar before the whole COVID thing. And CMC regulatory and supply chain strategies are always a question. And we're going to talk about some of the general things that are always ongoing and some of the COVID specific things that we've got happening right now. Security of supply, especially later phase 3, commercial, it's always an issue. We always have to think about how do we mitigate the risks? How do we make sure that we're not dependent on one company, one particular supply chain? And we try to do that. And the bigger your product, the better chance you have of being able to do that. You know, some of the smaller companies, some of the smaller products, you might not have enough there to be able to go to multiple sources. So putting that supply chain together and putting that strategy together is certainly an effort that that is always in discussion as we go forward. Many companies, most companies, later phase and even early phase have international supply chains. We're working around the world looking for the people who can do good technology with the right equipment, with the right price. And we're looking at that in development. We're looking at that in commercial manufacturing. We're looking at that all the time. And there are many reasons. India and China are places that many people go. There's a lot of good science happening there. There's a lot of manufacturing capability there. And of course, we all know that the prices from India and China and other countries will be lower than certainly they are in North America and Europe. So one of the things that we're trying to do, and there's ongoing compliance issues that we have to deal with. I think things, at least from the noise level, have been getting better on that front, but we still have that issue. We have that issue anywhere we go. But you know, some of these countries and areas of the world are having their own challenges and making sure that they stay compliant with EMA and FDA guidances. So security of supply is certainly important. You know, being on the other side of the world from, well, for me, who happens to be in the U.S. And other companies in the U.S., we have the challenges of logistics. We have the challenges of time. We're always on the phone at 6 p.m. or 6 a.m. to try to have a phone call, you know, with our factories, with our development teams. In particular, if you're a small company, trying to get over and visit these people before COVID, of course, was always a challenge. You know, you're taking, if you've only got 3 people in your CMC and regulatory group and they need to go over and visit the factory in China, it's a whole week out of the office where you're not doing many other things. So there are challenges with dealing with other parts of the world. And, you know, I think those are something that we constantly have to deal with. Now, obviously, COVID-19 has brought up a whole new series of challenges that we truly didn't think about before or didn't think was very likely before. Countries that are taking I'm going to serve my own people first approach, and that is happening to more or less degree in more or less industries. And the interesting thing is it's one of those things that's very hard to predict what's going to happen next. You know, I'm doing something as simple as working with a manufacturer in Canada from the US. Is that going to be an issue? Well, I would never have thought so until we started having a discussion about whether we were going to give Canada face masks. And all of a sudden that serve your own people first takes on a new meaning. Which means, of course, something like COVID-19 or some other short-term issue can really affect our logistics. How do we deal with that? What happens, you know, when this first started, the outbreak first started happening in India, not only was it a challenge of the factories being able to produce, but being able to actually transport your goods to the point of to the ports. As we're looking at that, and that has been a challenge as well. Obviously, there's a challenge of a lot of our products get shipped in the bellies of passenger planes, and there's not so many passenger planes going back and forth. So all of these things that we might have looked at if we really looked hard at our logistics and supply chain, but now we definitely have to take a look at those. So things we've got to take into account. And obviously, the political issues are always there. There's the rise and fall of nationalism and tariffs, and they just make that international supply chain riskier. But there are certainly reasons to do it. We couldn't bring back everything into our home countries if we wanted to. The capacity is just not there. And I don't really think we want to, but we just need to be aware of these different issues that can affect our supply chain. Intellectual property is always an issue. I think it's getting better, but it's still a challenge around the world. So, we've talked a little bit about that, but these risks are that, as we know with COVID-19, the current supply chains can be disrupted instantly. It does not happen very often. It hasn't happened very often in our lives, but it does happen. And we really need to look at risk mitigation strategies maybe a little bit further than we have before. A lot of times we try to keep our safety stocks as small as possible. We try to have just-in-time manufacturing. If we can do that, that may not always be the best solution. We may need to have strategic safety stocks in strategic places to make sure that we can continue to work in the event of a disruption. And as we're looking at multiple supply sources, we probably need to look at those geographically too. To have two supply chains that all come through China, for instance, doesn't mitigate all of the risk that can happen that we talked about in the previous slide. Companies could certainly face stockout situations if their supply chain isn't adequately risk mitigated. And development activities. We talk about supply, but if you're counting on one of the big development houses in India to be doing your product development activities, that could slow or stop due to pandemic work outages, whether that's in China, India, or the US, that can happen. And while you're thinking about that, don't forget that most of our key starting materials for our molecules don't come from North America, so they are coming from these other countries as well. So you got to take that supply chain all the way back. Next slide, please. So, we come to some of the strategies, which is to develop those multiple source supply chains, to really think about how we are going to deal if a part of the supply chain is suddenly disrupted. And, it's a risk-benefit approach. You can't have safety stocks for every possible contingency, every possible risk, because you'll never do business. But how do you be smart about that? Looking at the regulatory involvement, it's a lot of work to qualify a new source. It's a lot of work to update all your filings around the world. It's a lot of work to make sure that all of these multiple sources stay aligned with your regulatory commitments around the world. So it's going to take more work. It's going to take more resources and more thinking about it. This isn't simple, but being in a stockout situation is about the worst thing that can happen with all of our drugs, really. And we hope that some of the different things that the regulatory agencies are looking at now in terms of prioritizing, in terms of trying to triage and expedite certain things, maybe they're also starting to figure out different ways of doing things. We'll see what that happens, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. So with that, I will close my part of this and turn it back over to Graham for the long-term outlook.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So let's look and see what the future holds, and thinking about regulatory landscape. So a little bit of stargazing. Let's look forward 5 years and do a little bit of out-of-the-box thinking of where things may go. And I'm sure others will have different views about this, but here's a bit of a picture I'd just like to paint. So first of all, let's just wind the clock back 3 months ago. And did we expect to be working like we are today? Did we expect to be locked down and often sitting in front of our computers and doing webcasts, doing video calls all day. As Joe said at the beginning of this of the presentation today, when we first arranged to do this webcast, which was last November, we were brainstorming at that point on the subjects we'd consider. And as you can probably tell from my accent that I'm from Europe, we were starting to think, hey, what does it mean about Brexit and in regulation, and how's that going to work, and what sort of alliances are we going to be forming? Well, that kind of stuff, as you know, Brexit is, I don't even see that in the newspapers these days. So certainly, you know, we could not have imagined where we'd be today. So let's look and see what could happen. So will we still go into the office, for example? I heard just earlier this week of a company that is considering whether it needs its big offices going forward, or whether to have more satellites spread around the country so that staff can work from there if they have difficulty working from home. But let's think about where the regulations are going. So potentially, could we see that there is a real-time regulatory data portal gets created where clinical data gets uploaded directly from investigator sites to some sort of safe harbor, some sort of service system that the regulators get direct access to? Possibly we might look at getting earlier, but perhaps more conditional approvals with much more extensive PMRs going forward. Might we see an approval with a very restricted or a conservative label that evolves as more data are generated? So the agency takes an initial decision and awards a regulatory approval on condition that additional data are generated. In other words, we get a more restricted initial use. Now, clearly, if you think about that, the implications on patents and patent life, etc., there's a lot of considerations in there. What about if advisory committees or experts are consulted, but only where necessary to grant a full approval for a drug? So you get that initial, similar to how we get an accelerated approval today in the US or a conditional in Europe, but those initial approvals can go away if the data don't turn out. But that becomes a more regularly used paradigm moving forward. I talked a little earlier about advisory committees and how that would work. Maybe we end up with a slimmed down advisory committee process. Perhaps all meetings are conducted by video, and maybe there's an invitee only attendance. You have to register, and only those, there's limits on how many people can attend, and there's quotas, but who knows where that could go. And what about if the public distancing that we see becomes the norm? So we don't have any more face-to-face meetings with the regulators. It's only done by telecons or done by video. What if we don't have public gatherings as the norm, such as advisory committees, and we have to do things a little bit differently? So it's clearly we're in a changing world, and COVID-19 has created a paradigm shift. Now, is that temporary? Will we go back to how things were in February or in March of this year? So is 2020 just a blip? And the familiar regulatory landscape that we were all so used to resumes in 2021, you know, as if nothing ever happened. Let's just forget 2020. Everything's back to normal in 2021. Or will COVID-20 and COVID-21 mean that our world, never mind the global regulatory landscape, changes permanently? So perhaps a lot to discuss. That's where I'm going to stop. Joe, I'll hand it back to you now.
Thank you both. I really appreciate the comments, and it does foster, I believe, tons of discussion around a lot of these things. Before I ask some questions, Alex or Beth, are there any questions that have come in from our attendees?
Yes, so we have one question come through so far asking, will fast track approvals of COVID-19 related products trickle down to other products? And might this lead to a revision of approval timelines?
This actually, I think, can be answered both by Graham and Steve in different ways, but let's start with Graham.
I'm just trying to see if I can see the question on the panel, but I couldn't see it. Can you repeat it again, Alex, please?
Yeah, sure thing. The question is, will fast track approvals of COVID-19 related products trickle down to other products, and might this lead to a revision of the approval timelines?
Okay, well, I guess it's that's an interesting concept. I mean, possibly, who knows? I mean, I think we've seen the lots of comments about hydroxychloroquine and remdesivir, and I think we need to see the final evidence for those drugs of what happens. But for other drugs, that I think that there could well be an opportunity for agencies around the world to say, let's try some early approvals and see what we can find. But as I said earlier when I was talking about there's a bit of the management of the hype is necessary here. I mean, certainly we've got to have the expectations and we have to have the hope, and the general public needs to have the hope that something's around the corner to help with COVID-19. But there's an awful lot of hype, and as some politician somewhere keeps talking about fake news, we just need to see where that goes. But I think if we start to see some opportunities for fast track approvals, I think that will be welcomed. But we have to make sure that we don't end up having lots of early approvals and then lots of later withdrawals.
Yeah, I think if I could just add here, Graham, is that when we start to talk about what is happening is that the FDA is looking to utilize the emergency use authorization a lot with the drugs that are currently being developed for COVID. Now the question is that are some of these accelerated pathways for approvals things that could potentially be utilized going forward with other divisions? Now I know there's a lot of this. It's not emergency use authorization, but it is more creative regulatory, I think, in the oncology division already. So the question will be, do you guys think that will persist? And to second part of that question is more for Steve. Whenever any of this happens, Steve, as you know, when rapid acceleration of a drug approval takes place on the clinical side, it puts tremendous pressure on the CMC piece to be ready and be prepared for pre-approval inspections and things of that nature. So I'd be interested to hear from both of you. One, Graham, with regard to whether not emergency use, but whether more I'll call them streamlined regulatory processes might become the new norm. And if so, Steve, what might that be in terms of an impact on the CMC side?
Okay, let me start, Joe. I mean, becoming the new norm. I think the requirement, if you like, from the public to see promising new therapies getting quickly approved by regulators is going to be expected. And the fact that things are just going to be potentially perceived as being held up by red tape, it's either going to need some very clear communication about what has to happen, or we just have to be able to, we have to have regulators be able to respond quicker. I mean, I know, just speaking very parochially, in the UK, when we had some of the new COVID-19 diagnostic tests being proposed to be introduced, and the commentary in the newspapers was that there was it was taking a lot of time for the red tape, as they saw it, to be addressed, and this expectation that regulators cannot take weeks to approve things as they saw it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting comment, Graham, and we've talked about a couple of things. One is it's interesting to see that that especially with some of these, given the situation, there are quicker turnarounds and more risk being taken or being allowed to take in the clinic as we look at some of these different therapies and say, okay, let's give it a shot. Let's see what happens. And if it doesn't work, we'll pull it back, which is something that has not happened very often before. And you look at that just in is this something, will society continue to tolerate that level of risk? To say, we don't know that remdesivir works, for instance, but we're going to put it out there because the potential benefit is there. And I think as you get into CMC, some of the same questions will come up. You know, we know what the guidelines are, we know what the rules are for doing things. Will there be some tolerance to say we will cover a basic list of things? We will continue to do everything we had to do in the past, but while we're collecting 3 months of stability data on a new source, will we be able to continue? Will we be able to use that material potentially and provide data as we go? And I think that's one of the things I'm hoping that comes out of here is some of these, I'll call them rolling approvals. They're not really rolling approvals, but the fact that you put some data in and the benefit is worth the risk, and we continue to supply data, that applies from a clinic, but that also applies from a CMC point.
Yeah, and I think on both fronts, I think one mistake that regulatory professionals need to be careful about is their management cannot believe that all of a sudden, because of this, that the regulatory hurdles or the standards of approval are going to be less. I think that there was ways to streamline things, but the mantra about protecting public health with efficacious products and knowing what the benefit risk is, I don't see that as disappearing. And so we just need to be aware that as we advise our organizations in the drug development process, that though there may be some streamlined approaches both in the clinic and in CMC, I don't think that the approval hurdles are going to be, or the approval standards rather, are going to be markedly reduced. Steve and Graham, I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, but I know we have some questions coming in from the outside as well. We'll take those, but just if you could just comment on what I had just said, and then Alex, if you could maybe read some of the other questions that are coming in.
Yeah, Joe, just to come back to your point there, I don't think we can see a reduction in the requirement to establish safety, quality, and efficacy as the three cornerstones of an approval. I think managing expectations of the general public is going to be a real challenge for regulators, for governments, and also for the industry. You know, I think back to the days of the AIDS situation when that first appeared, and you had activists invading boardrooms of pharma companies. You know, there were people coming in demanding access to drugs that there was a certain amount of hype about in the press, and I have a slight worry about that happening now in this situation, and the stuff that gets broadcast around on social media about what a drug may or may not do. I mean, even I see things from friends of mine who have been what I would consider to be may not be in the industry, but are reasonably well versed in life and in experience. But some of the stories that they come to me with and say, well, what do you think about this bit of news? And it's the hype. So managing that is a challenge. But overall, I agree with you. I think the that there'll be a maintenance of the same fundamentals of safety, quality, and efficacy. Steve, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you on that. And you're right, Graham. I mean, the fact that all of these things are happening so quickly now, the genie's kind of out of the bottle for the regulators. How do you put it back in? But you're right, it's not going to be a change in what's required. I don't think there's any lessening of that. But, you know, the expectation, how it's managed, and we've talked about that before, it's going to be a real challenge for all areas.
So, Alex, do you have other questions coming in?
Yeah, we have a long list of questions here we can go through. So the next one is, how are inspection activities going to be impacted by this?
Well, I can take a look at my crystal ball. I know already I've been, one of my suppliers has had a virtual inspection by not the FDA, by another regulatory agency. You know, I think the agencies are going to have to rely on each other more in terms of the on-site visits. I think that's going to be a real challenge. But really, if you think about it, I was thinking about doing this, you know, myself with this same supplier. How do I do my own audit of that supplier remotely? And I guess there are ways to do it. I mean, we know how to interact. We're learning how to interact. Can we exchange documents in the Zoom room instead of sitting at the desk? A lot of that we can do. It's not going to be as effective, but I think you're going to see a lot more of that, and maybe it drives more of the mutual recognition rather than have everybody inspect every plant every time.
And Graham, what do you think about the clinical side? Because we still do site inspections and GCPs.
Yeah. I think there'll be perhaps a little bit less the inspections that'll take place, but I think it'll be interesting to see whether we can do how Steve's been describing it in the CMC, whether there's remote inspections, and you know, a lot can be achieved by sharing data on a computer. So potentially that could be a way that that this will go in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. Alex?
Alrighty. So looking ahead, what do you think about the pre-approval hype on CT engagement, positive or negative, and in the area of pre-approval promotion?
So I'm going to need a little clarification unless one of my colleagues can help me here. So pre-approval hype on CT engagement in the area of in the area of pre-approval promotion. Well, we can talk about that, but can we help me out here, guys? Do you know what the question is making reference to?
I'm wondering whether it's the kind of hype about what a particular product might do.
It looks like that. It looks like that user clarified their question there, saying clinical trials. They said there's lots of hype around the effectiveness.
Yeah.
Early pre-approval hype on the effectiveness of the drug. Is that what you mean? Yeah. Okay. All right, I get that now. So yeah, so we hear every day, whether it's from politicians or whether it's mostly, I guess, political, more than what I think the scientists and medical people are saying. But there is hype every time there's an opportunity, or every time there's a possibility that a drug is going to looks like it's got some benefit. We hear about it early, and in the old days, that would be called pre-approval promotion, and it's something that we would all steer away from. So I'm just curious as to, yeah, that's a good question. What do you guys think about that?
Well, it was interesting when the all the stuff started on remdesivir a couple of weeks ago, that on the day there was hype in the press about that, there was a very clear statement from the company on their website about that the efficacy and safety had yet to be established. So clearly trying to manage the expectation, and obviously when a bit more positive data comes out, but it's you know, they're able to say a little bit more. But it's it does if we go back to the pre-February days, it does get to be very close to pre-approval promotion. I completely agree. So that is something which will, I'm sure, the regulators are looking at, and it's about communication again, isn't it? And it's about how it's done in a balanced way, and being able to give hope to people versus giving them news. You know, it's there's going to be no vaccine for 12, 18 months, and we're going to be living in lockdown, and that's not what people want to hear. So it's a really, really tricky tricky equation to try and balance.
Yeah, I almost believe that it's coming through the press and it's coming through the politicians. I don't think you're going to be the companies. There's going to be a little leniency here around COVID and COVID only. I don't think it's going to wash with the other therapeutic areas in any way, shape, or form. But I would say that if you take a look at when I talk about leniency, I'm talking about specific to what you see in the press. I'm not talking about the companies. So the companies like Gilead developing remdesivir, I don't think that they were going to be in a position where they were going to be allowed to do pre-approval promotion any more than they would have in the past. So a lot of this is going to happen in the press, and it's going to continue to happen. The FDA commissioner's got a lot of face time right now, so Dr. Hahn will try to address these things as much as possible. And of course, I see Dr. Woodcock makes a lot of comments each day about a lot of this as well. So I don't think it's going to be seen necessarily as a green light for pre-approval promotion going forward with COVID or anything else for that matter. But that's my opinion. Okay, Alex.
Okay, so the next question we have asks, can you elaborate or speculate more on how agencies could take a more lenient look at the requirements for second sources and what that could encompass?
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit. You know, as we've kind of talked about, is it going to be more lenient? I don't know. Could it be where companies are allowed to again, in key situations, be able to submit the key data up front and continue to support that with ongoing data in the future? And will the agencies have a better look at that? Will they perhaps allow more of the changes being affected kind of approach to this? I mean, this is all speculation on my part. But it's one of the things that everybody's concerned. I mean, we look at even remdesivir right now of the supply chain. It's like, well, we got this thing that might work, but we were going to have to make a whole bunch of it. So the agencies have got to be sensitive to that. I know the people that are working in the COVID space right now, I mean, that is something that's very much of a concern, is if this thing works, how the heck are we going to supply it? So I think the agencies are sensitive to that, aware of this. I don't know if they're going to change any regulations, but it would certainly be helpful to have more of an interface and interaction with them as we go forward, and perhaps, you know, some kind of a rolling submission basis.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I think this next question, Alex, is one that we've already addressed. That was a clarification as to what the first one was. So
I see. Yeah.
So the next one was having mentioned. Yeah, that one. You probably can see that better than I.
Okay. Yeah. So having mentioned the rise of nationalism and serve our people first mind style, do you think the efforts on harmonization between regulatory regions can suffer a backlash, or its importance will be more apparent?
So that's an interesting question. And so having the benefit of Graham sitting in the UK, I think that would be an interesting perspective as well. And we'd like to hear the same from Steve as it pertains to CMC and manufacturing tech ops. So maybe we'll start with Graham.
I think at the highest, at the political level, it'll be said, no, we're all going to work together. So I think that the official statements will be exactly the same. Underneath, I suspect we'll see the same tensions we've always seen. That it's fine. Of course we're going to work together and collaborate, but we'll think of our jurisdiction first.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree. I mean, the whole harmonization effort for the past 20 years has been a very slow process, and you kind of look at it logically and think, why? It's especially from a CMC point, it's the same thing. It's the same the general regulations. But I think that is an area that it seems to be more, I'm going to say science-driven, but also from the regulators' point of just trying to be as efficient as they can to get all the work done that they have to do. It doesn't seem like these, I'm going to call them nationalistic things for lack of a better term, really are going to, I don't think they're really going to impact that harmonization. That's a train that's slowly moving along and will continue to move along.
Okay, thank you guys. If we could move to the next question then, Alex.
Sure thing. All right, so we have next one asks, is this a good time to enter a regulated market with non-COVID related products for the emerging entrepreneurs?
So, I think when I look at a question like this, I think it's always going to, we live in a regulated market. And I know it's a question of timing. I think it's going to be more a question of the asset. If it's an asset that brings incremental benefit to patients, regardless of the therapeutic area, I think it's a good time to enter a regulated market as much as any other time. Whether we will have issues of manpower at the agency, I do know that some divisions are struggling a little bit with regard to meeting certain PDUFA dates, but I think in general, the FDA will continue in each of their therapeutic areas to try to meet the regulatory obligations set out in PDUFA. Therefore, I would say that if an entrepreneur has an asset, which I had said earlier, advances the medical benefit to a patient, I do think it would still be worthwhile to do whatever we can do to bring that to patients as quickly as possible, COVID or no COVID. Graham?
I agree, Joe. I think in many respects it might be a greater opportunity for entrepreneurs to be bringing new things to the markets, because the questions are being asked already. Were we too slow to react to COVID-19? What if we'd been ahead of the curve? So what if any new therapies that are coming along for whatever it might be, is that, let's get new promising therapies to the market quicker. That might be something that comes out of this. So provided that efficacy is established and I've got a positive benefit risk, I think it could be a great opportunity.
Yeah, and I would even say the same for companies that are going to be going into the generics market, because the pricing questions in the pharmaceutical industry will not go away. And as you all know, FDA doesn't control pricing, and the only way they can have some influence over pricing is the rapid approvals of generics. So I would agree. I think that it will be somewhat business as usual, and I don't see this as a negative for entrepreneurs that want to move into the business at all. Steve, I don't know if there's anything on the manufacturing side that would influence this one way or another, but what do you think?
I don't think on the manufacturing side that there's anything particularly there. I mean, I think there's certainly the questions of, are the clinics going to be available to do this? And it depends on what your therapy is. One of my clients is working in a pulmonary indication, and it's like there's not a chance you're going to get in with those people right now. So that part of that is dependent on it, and then part of it becomes all of this logistics of can we still get things done? But I don't think there's anything inherently different about that. That said, I mean, if Gilead is approaching you about making remdesivir, or Pfizer is outsourcing so that they can make a vaccine, it is going to make manufacturing of our small early compounds that much more of a challenge just to get into these places.
Makes sense. Okay, Alex?
Sure thing. So the next question we have is, do you think that the public's expectation with regard to the risk benefit ratio is really different after COVID-19?
So the public's expectation regards the risk benefit ratio. I don't know. I mean, as a consumer, if I took myself out of this business, I would hope that there's still the idea that the risk benefit ratio would be a favorable one to the benefit side, regardless, both from a company perspective, sponsor perspective, and an agency perspective, whether it be here or the EU or anywhere in the world for that matter. I don't know that COVID-19 is going to necessarily change that mindset, certainly not in the agencies. Again, it may change the mindset of streamlining how drugs get approved, but I don't think they're going to do it at the expense of a favorable benefit risk ratio. But Graham, what do you think?
I'm with you. I think there's going to be a greater awareness of benefit and risk, because I feel that generally, and this is a huge generalization, but I will say that generally people, the average person, does not understand that there are risks with taking any drug. So therefore, the expectation is that if you're prescribed a drug because you've been to see your GP, that it's going to solve whatever you've gone to see your GP about, and you're given a drug, it's going to solve your problem. And the thought of that you might get a side effect as well as solving your problem is not necessarily fully understood. So I do think that there will be a greater awareness of risks as well as benefits, but it's back to that same point I've said this a couple of times about managing the hype. So it's managing the hype while being realistic and not trying to scare people.
I think it's interesting that if we look at hydroxychloroquine and the data so far, I mean, this is maybe a public realization of those risks and benefits. Well, what could possibly go wrong? Well, it doesn't work, and it gives you higher heart risk. Now, I know this is still early, and that's not a conclusion, but maybe the public is starting to see some of that risk benefit just from that one example. And remdesivir is another one. We're going to see how well that works.
Completely
Both good. Yeah. Alex, we're approaching 1 o'clock, and I don't know how many more questions there are, and if we can continue or what you would like to do, but maybe you could advise.
Yeah, sure thing. I think we have time for one more question. There's a last one on cybersecurity that might be useful to answer.
Okay, let's do that then.
So I'll just kind of combine these two questions here. So just asking, how will the cybersecurity of a company's data be managed when interacting with regulators, especially in this time where we're doing things remotely?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm necessarily qualified to really speak to that. I don't know, Graham, do you feel, or Steve, comfortable in addressing this one?
But on cybersecurity, that's for sure.
It's certainly going to be a challenge. I mean, this is something, it's not just FDA and regulators. If we're going to be working remotely, we're going to have more secure platforms than Zoom. Zoom works great. You get right on, you can see everything, but it's not secure. And the more security you get, the less user-friendly it is. I don't have an answer to it, but right now the interactions with the agencies are secure. But as we start looking at potentially having, direct connections between the clinic and the agency, like we need new systems, better systems.
Yeah, where it's going to really be interesting is, as Graham mentioned in his presentation, this concept of the real-time data going straight to the agency for reviewers to take a look at along with the sponsor. If in fact that happens, and it happens routinely, that's clearly got to be something that is of concern both to the FDA and sponsors alike. And there will be experts on the IT side along with the regulators who are going to help make sure that it's as protected as possible, I would imagine. But as I said, I'm not an expert in this area other than to know that you're both right. It's something that there has to be an awareness and it has to be addressed. Alex?
All righty. So yeah, we'll start to wrap things up here. So I just want to thank everyone for attending today, and a special thank you to all of you guys as presenters for taking time out of your schedule and to put on this presentation for everyone. I know we got a lot of questions here that are still remaining. So for those that submitted questions that we did not answer today, rest assured that we're going to supply these questions to our presenters for follow-up after the program. So as a final reminder before we sign off, just to please return to the RAPS Learning Portal to access the on-demand recording. We'll post that there within 2 days after the program, and also to take the evaluation there to receive your RIC credit. So thank you all for your attendance today, and please have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.